Is the guillotine the best method of execution?
Let's dissect that. Hi, I'm Nico from Paris, and this is Kat,
Bonjour. Also from Paris.
also from Paris. Today we're going to talk about the guillotine, a French invention.
Was it invented by the French though?
I think the Scots actually used it before the French. Can you tell us about the famous, I think it was called the Scottish maiden?
Well, you're right. You're absolutely right. While most people associate the guillotine with the French and the French Revolution because so many hundreds of thousands of lives were lost by this method of execution, the Scottish maiden was an oak structure with materials such as iron, steel, and lead used to make sure that the blade fell quickly and heavily on the neck of those who were to be executed.
Heavily.
Very heavily. From pictures that we have found upon our research while we have been looking into this subject, I'm not going to lie. The blade looks a little bit
Blunt.
it could do with some sharpening. I'm not going to lie. Any good smithy could have fixed that one up. But anyway, the lead was there to finish the job. So I'm going to go out on a limb, pardon the pun, and say that it was probably a little bit more painful when it came to crunch time than the guillotine was by the time it was a little bit more refined for the purposes of execution during the French Revolution. Now, the thing with the Scottish maiden, it started in 1564, which is a lot earlier than the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror started. And basically, it didn't have the stocks to hold somebody's head in place. So big burly men were required to hold the person down manually because there were no straps or stocks to hold them in place. So you can imagine there were probably quite a few botched executions and quite a lot more blood spray and brain matter.
I love a botched execution.
Who doesn't love a botched execution? I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I get out of bed for. But at the end of the day, that's not what they were going for.
So the question that you ask yourself is, of course, who came up with this wonderful idea of cutting people's heads off with a machine? Because that's one of in mankind's biggest inventions. And believe it or not, the man who invented the guillotine was called Monsieur Guillotine, Joseph Guillotine. He was a doctor. He was a doctor in the Academy of Medicine in Paris, and he was considered as a humanist, someone who was meant to bring good ideas to the people. And he came up during the French Revolution with a brilliant idea, because the question was what to do with the kings, with the clergy, with the aristocrats. People wanted to execute them, but since it was the French Revolution, they had to use a brand new method of executing them that would not look like what had been done before by the monarchy, which was mostly hanging. But for example, when there was a regicide means actually trying to kill a king, they would use more barbaric methods like drawn and quartering, So what Dr. Guillotine wanted to come up with was a method of actually using the same machine for everybody. Equality, yeah. Equality was one of the three principles of the French Revolution.
He was one of the first people to go for equality. Yeah, Dr.
Exactly,
Guillotine.
exactly, Dr. Guillotine.
What a legend.
He was a legend. So in late 1789, same year as the French Revolution, he came up to the assembly and he gave a speech telling that it was time for the French to use a machine to execute the death penalty equally, swiftly, without cruelty, to both peasants and aristocrats. Dr. Guillotin had a very good friend at the University of Medicine of Paris, Dr. Louis. Dr. Louis was able to come up with different practical considerations regarding the blade. According to him, using a blade with a 45-degree angle would cut easier through the neck. You have to understand that the tissues surrounding the neck and the muscles are among the strongest muscles in the human body.
When you think about it, a flat blade, it doesn't matter how sharp it is or how much force is behind it. Of course, it's going to cut through the tissue, the bone, and everything it needs to cut through. But it's the same as if you have a slightly blunt kitchen knife and you're trying to cut tomatoes or onions or apples. It's easier if you go in at a slight angle first and then curve through. So basically, he created this idea that if we have an angled blade, it will cut one side first and then easily sever the rest. And, well, as they say, the rest is history.
He also came up with the idea of circling the neck with a wooden device because there was a lot of botched execution back in the days.
Exactly like we had with the Scottish maiden, having to
Yes.
manually hold people down and having men, women, and even children alike flailing about, causing the blade to fall in all sorts of places except the intended spot to sever the head from the rest of the body. So this reduced the need for manpower and big burly Scottish men, and basically made sure that the blade fell exactly where it needed to every single time, thus reducing the number of botched executions as well.
Dr. Louis then decided to contact a friend of his for the construction of the first guillotine. And believe it or not, that man was making a living building harpsichords. So with this experience, he managed to come up with a plan, and he came up with the very first guillotine that was created in 1792. Didn't take long for that guillotine to be used for the first time. The first time it was used was at a French hospital, Kremlin-Bicêtre. It was a French hospital in the southeast of Paris, and they used sheep to test them. So they decapitated sheep, saw how the blade reacted, and they decided to adopt this newly invented machine. And the first execution took place 2 months after. The first man to be executed by the guillotine was one Jacques Nicolas Pelletier. He was a robber. We do not know many details about the reason why he was sentenced to death, probably killed someone during a robbery. And the fact is that he is known as being the very first man to be executed by a guillotine on April 25th of 1792. And this was the beginning of a bloodshed. Yes, bloodshed. At least, a bloodshed. Because you know what? It was also the beginning of what was called the Reign of Terror. During 3 years, more than 40,000 people were guillotined.
So if we were to create, I don't know, a Tinder profile for the guillotine, what kind of things would we be putting into the profile to make sure that we got maximum, I don't know, head count? Now, this bad boy measured in at least 4.5 meters in height. 4.5 meters. That's one tall, strapping lad. Hello. So tall, dark, and handsome, we got that on lock already.
Yeah.
And then we've got a blade falling from a height of 2.25 meters. And it weighed 40 kilograms. 40 kilograms is more than half my body weight. I know that you guys think that I'm smaller than that. That's cute, but no. and it would fall at the rate of 6.4 meters per second. So I don't know about you, but if I wanted to date with this bad boy, sign me up.
But then who carried out the execution? The executioner! There was a rumor saying that they would get a bonus per head, but it was totally false. They would be chosen by the French government. They didn't have a choice. They were usually taken from the military. What's interesting is that they had aides. People would aid them, and they were called photographers. Guess why they were called photographers? Okay, you have to picture this. The executed were laid down on some kind of wooden plank, a slab, okay, and the head was pushed in that hole. And at the other side of the guillotine, there was this photographer who would grab their hair and pull so that they would stand still. But why the photographer? Because the photographer tells you to stand still. Get it?
Jeez.
Yeah. It was a joke. But yeah, they were really called the photographer. True story. And when the heads were shaven, they would grab them by the ears and hold them in place.
But how did you get a job as an executioner? Did you go to seek.com? Did you go to Career One? Did you hand in resumes to your local butcher shop? No. They tended to hire internally back in those days, so a lot of the jobs, even well before machines such as the guillotine or even the Scottish maiden were invented, when it was back in the days of a man wielding an axe or a sword and hoping to God that he actually hit the spot and didn't have to make several cuts, most of the time these jobs were handed down from family members to friends of family, or from a father to son, or father to nephew, or someone along those lines. So again, you could say they hired internally. They did not outsource these sorts of jobs. Many of the executioners, other than chief executioners, you could probably consider apprentices, but it was all familial kind of relations, and all familial, how would you say? It's not what you know, but who you know. For one of the many, many people who witnessed firsthand an execution via guillotine during the French Revolution, the following can be said from their account. Once the carotid artery was severed, now the carotid artery is the main artery that runs down the neck from the brain to the rest of the body. Once this was severed, 2 powerful squirts of blood sprayed out over at least 2 meters in front of the guillotine as the headless body tumbled into the awaiting wicker casket beside the machine. A less powerful spray of around 30 centimeters came from the head and was mostly brain blood, cerebral fluid leaking from the neck.
And the crowd would cheer, "What a squirter!"
We all love squirters.
Yeah.
The head would be collected in a smaller basket in front of the guillotine, and in case of quick, consecutive executions, they could put up to 3 heads in one basket and up to 3 bodies in the same wicker casket which was waiting aside the machine.
And some executioners even told later on that they could observe the bodies twitching inside the wicker casket for up to 1 hour after the execution.
That's a long time.
Yeah, that's a long time. You know when you cut the head of a chicken and they keep on running?
Well, not everyone who's watching is going to know that, but...
Yeah, that's something that happens in farms all the time, but yeah. Some bodies react after death and bodies would twitch. Yeah, it's scary, but yeah.
The further away from the brain the neurons are, the longer it takes them to die, because it takes longer for the brain to send that message. And when that spinal cord's been severed in between, it's kind of hard for the brain to send that message, so it takes a little bit longer for those neurons to get the message to die.
During the French Revolution, the executions were quite a show. There were crowds cheering each time the executioner would cut off a head. They would throw stones at the executed, and even the guillotines themselves, their nicknames For example, when the guillotine was painted entirely in white, they would call it the Virgin. And when it was splattered with the blood of the executed,
Not a virgin anymore.
Yeah, not a virgin anymore. So the crowd would say that it was deflowered. Yeah, we French people, we're funny, you know.
Hilarious.
We're funny like that.
Hilarious.
Yeah. But, you know, people would sell trinkets and merchandising before an execution. Little guillotines for earrings, and they would sell posters.
Kind of like, you know, the little trinkets you get when you go near the Eiffel Tower now.
Yeah, exactly. Except it was a guillotine. You can
For
actually
public execution.
Yeah.
Woo!
That the rich would wear when they would assist to an execution. There was an execution, I think it was in 1794, and there was a crowd of 200,000 people gathering to see that execution.
That's like the Melbourne Cup.
Yeah,
That's
it's amazing. For that time, it's amazing. People loved executions. They really loved them. Even school teachers, they would bring their school classes to the execution
Wow,
to educate
I never got a field
them.
trip like that.
Yeah, it was the best field trips for them
I
because
feel
they.
ripped off.
Yeah, me
I
too.
got a trip to the aquarium.
You know what the executions were called, by the way? They were called the Red Mass. Yes, the Red Mass. That was the La Messe Rouge. That was the word that was used by the crowd to describe the event.
Well, I can understand the reason behind the colouring, but mass?
Mass, because it was a
Almost ritualistic.
mockery. It was a mockery of religious belief, because the French Revolution was about mocking the clergy and mocking the priests. So the traditional mass was replaced by what they called the Republican Mass, which was about cutting the heads of the priests. So usually all those executions took place really well. There was no incidents, etc. But sometimes there was some botched executions. Maybe the crowd even preferred them because it was different. It was even funny sometimes. So yeah,
Hilarious.
There was this time when an executioner accidentally cut off 3 of his fingers when the blade fell.
Okay, I'd probably laugh at that.
Yeah, I would love that about that too. There was another one when the executioner had forgotten to remove the head of the previous executed from the basket at the other end of the guillotine. So when he put the head of the next one, the man just saw the decapitated head staring at him from the basket, and he tried to pull away by backing off. And of course, when the blood fell, it cut through his scalp, and it did not decapitate him, but he had half of his forehead cut in half.
What happened?
Yeah, because he tried to.
But what did they do?
The executioner turned towards the crowd and said, "Should I try to cut his head again, or do we leave him like that?" And
What do you reckon, boss? Should I finish the job or just go home? It's Friday.
Exactly. Yeah.
You
But
know?
some of the executed would
Oh my god.
pull up a fight and try to get away from that machine. So yeah, that's why there was so many botched executions, and sometimes the blade would fall several times on the neck without even succeeding in cutting it completely. So they had to saw through the neck muscles with a big knife. Sometimes it was even the executioner's wife who would do this in front of the cheering crowd.
Any seasoned butcher would have been sitting here just going, mate, you could have just offered, like,
Exactly.
I've got a sharpening stone right here.
Yeah, right here.
Like,
But yeah. Botched executions, especially when it's a guillotine.
so this, I guess, is why they invented the stock part, which is, as some of you probably know, the stocks of the medieval period, where someone was immobilized with their hands and their head in holes, so that people could publicly ridicule them. I guess that's why that aspect was introduced to the guillotine.
Yeah, exactly.
So that somebody didn't have to physically, manually hold someone down, because if someone's scared to die,
You know what? That sometimes
or if I saw a dead head in a basket, I'd be trying to hightail it out of there too. So
I've read something about an executed guy being his neck being so large that it wouldn't fit in the hole. So they had to put it on the.
this wasn't the same
push
guy that
him
was
on
in the
the-
memes a few years ago, was it?
Oh yeah, no, the big big neck guy. No, yeah, probably would have a hard time
Maybe
under
a
the
relative.
guillotine. Yeah,
Maybe a relative.
Yeah, but yeah, this guy they let the blade fall on his neck several times, and they had to cut through the neck with a saw. Imagine how painful this was. So yeah, sometimes the executions were really swift. It took less than a second for the blade to cut through the neck, but sometimes it would take minutes.
There was also the story of the guy who decided that he wanted to rather try and shoot himself in the head to kill himself, because
Yeah, Robespierre.
he did not want to be killed by the guillotine, because he had championed so much for its use, but when he realized that he was going to be condemned to death, he decided, this isn't how I want to go. So he shot himself, but all he succeeded in doing was obliterating his jaw. So when the time came for him to go to the guillotine, the executioner brutally, carelessly ripped off the bandages, probably taking half of his face with them.
People did not stop being executed after the French Revolution, of course. The guillotine was used for over than 200 years, up until 1977. That was the very last execution of a human being by the guillotine in France.
By which stage?
Yeah.
By which stage there were at least 400,000 people who had lost their heads, literally, to the guillotine.
Yep.
So the Reign of Terror, otherwise known as the French Revolution, depending on who you ask, was just a tiny blip on the radar of how many people lost their lives to the guillotine, whether they were innocent, guilty, male, female, or even children. There were
Even
quite
children, yeah.
Quite a lot of children that went to the guillotine.
It's horrifying when you think about it, but children as young as 9 years old were led to the guillotine. Imagine the horror of this. Yeah, this was horrifying. Yeah.
In the early morning of the 17th of June 1939, a man by the name of Eugene Wiedemann was led to his death to be executed by guillotine, and his was going to be the last ever public execution by means of guillotine in France. He had been found guilty and was convicted of multiple kidnappings and murders, including that of an American socialite who, along with her mother, had visited France, and her mum was showing up to events, but she wasn't. So naturally, being that she was an up-and-coming dancer, people started looking. He was found guilty of all of these crimes, and on this date, early morning, he was led to his death to be condemned to death by the guillotine. Now, because of the fact that there was a socialite, someone who was up and coming and whose mother was fairly prominent in the American entertainment scene at the time, there was a growing crowd. I mean, executions by guillotine were already a very, very public, entertaining public spectacle. But this one in particular had such a rowdy crowd that people were clamoring over each other, and by the time he got there, people were so unruly that his actual execution was delayed by several moments. So instead of like the normal person being led there, laid down, head put in the stock, blade being dropped within seconds, there were almost a couple of minutes that actually passed before all of that took place, between him lying down and the blade falling. And so because of this, we now have probably the only surviving footage of somebody being executed publicly by a guillotine, as well as several photographs that were taken at the time of his execution. Now, we can show you some of the footage.
Yeah, let's watch them.
Let's watch the footage. Fun fact about this execution is the up-and-coming Hollywood actor Christopher Lee, who at the time was 17 years of age, actually attended Eugene Weidman's execution. He's the only person that we know of note that actually attended it. Rest in peace, good man. Rest in peace. Now, after the execution, the crowd became quite unruly, to the point where the authorities were completely disgusted. There were people clamoring over each other, trying to dip their handkerchiefs in the blood that was spilling onto the cobblestones in front of the guillotine from the headless body, and people were just behaving in such a manner that the authorities decided that this would be the last ever public execution carried out in the country. And they made good on their word. There were no public executions after this date. In fact, in 1977, that was the last official use. So there was quite a few decades in between the last public execution and the last official execution via guillotine. And in 1981, both the guillotine and the death penalty were abolished altogether in France, meaning that if you did a boo-boo, you just got a few consecutive life sentences.
Even when they're about to die, some people keep their sense of humor, and such was the case of Marie Antoinette, even if she did not do it on purpose. But right before being executed, she said, "Oh, sorry, Mr. Executioner, I just stepped on your foot." Yeah.
Big whoopsie.
Yeah, big whoopsie. Danton was one of the main revolutionaries. He was a big advocate of the guillotine, and he was executed, of course, because
Fitting.
yeah, you die by the sword, you die by the sword. And it was really fitting, and he said to the executioner, "Show my head to the people, it deserves it." Interesting.
An exhibitionist till the very end. Imagine that.
Exactly. One of my favorite quotes from an executed person on the guillotine was by one Fouquier d'Inville, another revolutionary.
That was not a swear word, by the way.
No, Fouquier d'Inville. What? Revolutionary? What do you mean?
Never mind, keep
Yeah,
going.
never mind, keep going. So, where is he? Because I'm reading, I need notes for this. Sorry about that, but I don't know them by heart. Oh yeah, you know what he said? It's a funny one. He said, "Me, at least, I'm not dying with an empty stomach."
Which I'm sure would have been received well by all of the
Yeah.
starving peasants of the French Revolution who had to sell their teeth. If anybody has seen Les Miserables, then you will understand exactly the plight of some of the people who would have been witnessing this, and I'm sure they were like, yeah, bye.
I will end this quote by a quote from a serial killer called Dr. Petiot. He was called the Great Liquidator.
The Great Liquidator.
Right, he killed lots of people during the Second World War, mainly Jewish families who thought that he would help them fly away from the country.
He basically promised them freedom from the Nazis
Exactly.
and then took them to his house in Paris, under which he had a pit of quicklime and dissolved them.
Exactly.
And when authorities finally found out, probably because of the stench of his apartment when they walked past, there were floor-to-ceiling suitcases and personal belongings, most of the jewellery items in which he had cashed in and received good amounts of money for. So he was not a very nice person.
Nah. But you know what he said before being executed, and that makes him a nice person, I guess. He said it won't be a pretty sight.
Oh, thanks for the heads up.
Yeah.
Wow,
So
is that
was-
a really, that was not even an intentional pun.
Yeah, no.
Heads up, heads roll. Sorry,
You're the best.
just patting myself on the back for that unintentional pun.
Exactly.
But seriously, of course, it's not going to be pretty. But I'm sure a lot of people were happy to see the demise of the great liquidator, Dr. Marcel Petiot. Absolute prick! Anyway.
So that was the last quote, and now we're going to talk about the survival of the head after decapitation.
Something that you have read quite a lot about.
I have read quite a lot about it. there was experiences by doctors who had an agreement with the condemned right before they were executed. There was one doctor who asked one of the person that was about to be executed to blink each time that he would ask a question to his decapitated head. And it would blink once for yes and twice for no. Right.
That's where that comes from,
Exactly.
for anyone wondering.
So he picked up the head right after the execution, and he had a chronometer, right? He kept on asking questions. How do you feel? Do you hear me? Is your name so-and-so? And the head would blink for 10 seconds. Then the eyes went, more or less glassy. And then the doctor called him by his name, and the decapitated opened its eyes wide, like if he had heard his name, right?
It was described as somebody waking from a deep slumber to the sound of their name being called.
And that 15 seconds
like that
after the decapitation. Imagine that, 50 seconds. 30 seconds after the decapitation, the head was still blinking when asked questions. So the doctor noted that human conscience remained up to 1 minute after decapitation.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
But that brings me to my next point. Like, if you cut off somebody's arm, like if somebody has their arm amputated, they have phantom pain. Does a severed head register phantom pain from their missing entire body? Like, did they ever discuss this?
I have an idea. We organize.
We're not organizing an execution.
No, but you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna do a Ouija board with all the serial killers who were decapitated. Peter Curtin, Henri Landru, Marcel Petiot.
You speak French, so you can talk to those guys.
I'll talk to them in French. They were all executed. As you might know, the head of Landru is supposed to be in the Museum of Death in L.A.
I've been there and there are questions. I've seen it. It's definitely a mummified severed head.
Is it Landru?
People have questions about the legitimacy
We have
of
questioned. We, the people, deserve
It's definitely
an
a
answer.
severed head. It's
We
a
deserve
beautiful
an
severed head.
Yeah,
I
it
have
is.
to say, as a mummified specimen, it is beautiful. But is it really Bluebeard? We have questions.
But the head of Peter Curtin, which is displayed in Ripley's museum, is the actual head of Peter Curtin.
Open like a book.
Yeah, exactly.
For your pleasure.
For your pleasure.
I should say viewing pleasure because that sounded wrong.
So the idea is to make a seance with those decapitated serial killers and ask them if they saw themselves separated from their own bodies. If they saw the blood squirt from the open wounds, like Curtin said, because he said before being executed that it would be the ultimate thrill for him to see his own blood squirting from his own neck.
Let's be honest, he was kind of like not all there. He's a stubby short of a six-pack. But, I mean, really, they weren't studying things such as phantom pain back in the day. It wasn't really something that was even... I'm not even sure they were aware that it was something that existed back then.
Yeah.
So they were just looking for terms of consciousness and responsiveness in the deceased, in how long after they were executed. But phantom pain was not something that was discovered until many, many, many years later. So I'm definitely keen, if anyone wants to watch us do a seance and try and ask these questions. Hey, Grey Liquidator, did you feel your whole body being taken away, or like, did you not really care?
You know what would make the seance really cool? If that Ripley and the Museum of Death sent us the heads. We would put them on the Ouija board, right? The head of Curtin, the head of Landru, and they would dialogue with each other, and we would turn the planchette, and they would answer the questions. That would make a great show for serial pleasures.
We have enough room on the board for this. We're gonna have to make an extra large Ouija board, which we can do.
Yeah, we can do. If you have contacts with the Museum of Death and Ripley's, please contact them for us. We will make the show. It will be the best show ever.
Promise you that.
Until then,
we will see you soon
with another video.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for watching.
And we will see you soon for another dissection on another topic.
Another topic. Bye.
Bye.